the census, data tells us that 57% houses in Mumbai are one-room tenements. All right. Now, when you quote a statistic like that, automatically it means you need more houses, right? And so you would then say, okay, no, now we need more houses. Now, how do you get it? State has no money. So then what do? You facilitate developers, right? You increase the FSI, you get more uh, building rights for the to subsidize houses, and then you land up getting what we see around us, these crazy, like, there's redevelopment happening everywhere. So you have slum rehabilitation, you have rehabilitation of old buildings which suddenly become these towers, which loses that kind of urban form that we spoke about, right? They
Yeah.
become
Mhm.
isolated apartments, so there's no form of security at all, right? Security is seen as the CCTV camera security,
Yeah.
as opposed to the kind of social security that
Security.
that other form afforded, right?
Yeah, yeah.
This is because we're not experientially understanding these spaces at all. We're seeing them through the narrow frameworks of the statistic and the map from a cartographic point of view, right? So one of these people in Zawawadi actually told me, we could live in the pandemic, through the pandemic, because we had a house like this, because we were not confined to the home, because the neighborhood was the home, the whole building was the home,
Yeah.
and that's and they are looking at the redevelopment buildings around them. They're saying, we may get slightly bigger spaces, but it will not be the same space. I mean, it'll not be a space I can call a home, because I do not have all these extended possibilities, right? So I think that's something that gets completely missed out, that the experiential ways of thinking of space, the ways of starting to, for example, we said, it's really the idea of the public and the private completely gets separated, right? Because you have this apartment. In this case, the public and the private is really kind of mixed up, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
So
yeah,
when
yeah.
you require privacy, it's possible. You can close the door, you can create the space of your own, but it's possible to become part of the entire building at some point, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's important, and that's where we kind of come from, that it's important to change the frameworks, because it almost seems like it's the obvious. No, if you quote
Yeah.
something like that, 57% people live in one room tenements, you're not looking at the experiential logics. Immediately, it leads to the next step and the next step, right? And that's where you're getting this environment around you, which is completely lacking any kind of social life,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
All
yeah.
these buildings that you're seeing around us.
Or at least social life as is known by the city.
Yeah.
And what surprises us, and your work really brings this out all the time, is that um, a place like Mumbai should always at least have a reaction to this on a social level. Like, we as architects have, how could we think that because we grew up in these homes, didn't we, some of us?
Yeah.
And we've always considered this sort of a cleanup to be it's not gentrification, it's modernity. And
Yeah.
but it's some, in some ways, there hasn't been much of a reaction to, uh, even in terms of when we consider redevelopment, right? Redevelopment has a tendency, we were talking about this, that when one apartment building in a neighborhood is approached, we're talking about just the gossip, it spreads like wildfire. People try to go and pay very high prices to residents who have don't know that this redevelopment might or might not happen for that particular apartment building, but there's this push for consolidation of property, and you can see
Yeah.
sort of capitalization of that happening so much faster and so aggressive, um, that I don't know what design might be able to do in these, within these sort of dynamic happenings, let's say. How do you see this? Because is it just a matter of policy, or do you see it as a as a matter of pedagogy?
Yeah. So I think, I mean, there are a couple of things. Like, for example, one thing is that, though it may appear like that things are happening so fast, actually, if you look at on the ground, they're not happening that fast.
Ah,
There are lots of projects which are, on the crux of things. There's not enough. I mean, there's so many houses that are unsold.
Yeah.
There's a kind of speculative bubble almost, right? So these are not spaces for living so much as for speculation. But on the other hand, and this is again something that we've been arguing, that because we think of the this idea that like the statistic actually tells us that you require so many homes, you suddenly realize that you require that this is the gap between that statistic, for that statistical imagination, the gap between the demand and the supply currently, even after 20 years, and I'm talking about Mumbai, 20 years of active policy in all kinds of things, in rehousing old buildings, in slum redevelopment and all of that, in even public sector housing. The gap is so absurd that it will require 100 years to fill that gap. Okay, because the private developers, the market has been able to supply only so much, because it works with market logics, right?
Yeah.
It only
Yeah.
works when there is when you're able to make profit, a lot of profit, right? So it works in places of very high real estate. It works when you do not have multiple tenancies that are creating
clashing.
complexity in that kind of land itself. The titles have to be clear, and
Mm-hmm.
titles are never clear because there are all of these multiple claims, and that's how life is led, right? And
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
exactly what I'm telling you now, that modern logic requires this clarity. It requires to create clarity, you require muscle power. There's violence. You
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
to violently wipe out certain tenures to be able to create clear sort of titles, and that's when you will be able to build a building. Yeah, and but
Yeah.
we don't see all of that as architects. You don't see that that's the violence that is going on to clean up and clarify, land, right? So on the other hand, that's what we've been arguing, that a, to not have this violence, and B, to not have these absurd gaps. If you look again closely, and like the example I gave you, it's not that people are homeless. People have houses. There
Yeah.
are multiple houses that are there. Is it possible to kind of look at, repairing and retrofitting,
Yeah.
as an idea that in some ways you work with the existing stock, and
Yeah.
you start looking at other ways of thinking of home, where the home then becomes extended, like the example I gave you, right? if you
Mm-hmm.
if you start thinking of investing in places where the neighborhood becomes home, the city becomes home. Why do we only think of home as this propertied space, the square meter? And that's all the fights happening today. You go
Yeah.
to a cooperative housing society meeting, and people will fight for like 3 square feet of space.
Yeah.
Make the
Yeah.
wall smaller so that I get extra 3 square feet of space. But I think that's where this imagination is so limited. Of
Yeah.
what I consider home is limited to the propertied idea of the home. I have a whatever 50 square meter house, or I have 100 square meter house. That becomes the idea of the home that gets spoken about in popular circles, in our every. I mean, even when architects are speaking about it, they're talking about that idea of the home. but
Yeah.
but what we are doing often is we are conflating the idea of the house and the home. House is that propertied
Yeah.
idea, but the
Yeah.
home is much more than that, right? So
Yeah.
is it possible to then work with logics where you're designing in ways that you're thinking of neighborhoods and cities becoming home as much as the houses?
Yeah.
And for that, we need different frameworks of thinking itself.